Ayn Rand's essay of the Objectivist Ethics, but some questions will kind of trail off. It's not like we have to pursue them, but just maybe like a few points on those questions. So we were talking about a man's life as a continuous whole in the last conversation we had, and how we can, refer back to previous experiences and integrate them. We can apply knowledge that we've managed to accumulate from the past to present day situations. And so in that sense, we're different from animals. And you talked about, I think, a beaver building a dam. You gave that example as well.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the limit of its ability. What she was also talking about, animals living in cycles. So like they'll repeat these cycles through the seasons, whereas humans don't necessarily repeat cycles, but move in a kind of straight line, integrating everything from the past, or they can do that. So anyway, that was the context, I think, for the last bit of the conversation. And I was wondering, this is not a question to you because maybe you don't have the answer, but is there a lot of thought or some essay or someone who's spoken about how best to integrate everything from our past? Like, what is an appropriate method? What are some good questions to ask to extract the most value from lived experiences? Is there some thought that's been put into that?
I guess it would depend in what sense or what kind of integration you want. We can think about integration in terms of scientific knowledge from past experiences and gathering all that known information, integrating into something that continues or builds upon what you already had. And there's a lot of discussion within, well, broadly speaking, philosophy of science, and even specifically within objectivist literature, there's a lot of discussion about scientific development. I believe there's a book called The Logical Leap by Leonard Peikoff, or by someone else that Leonard Peikoff endorsed it. And that's the extensive discussion about the development of scientific ideas, like, say, development of physics and whatnot like that. And there's a whole lot of books you could read about objectivist conceptual development, and that will give you an idea of how you integrate information, proper ways of thinking, how to think logically and soundly, not just about like the logical coherence, but the way you take information, what counts as evidence, what counts as perceptual evidence. And those are two main things you would ever look at if you want to get a deeper sense of how to do it. I mean, Rand, really the most she presents, I think, it's what her sketch and her theory is about how children will do it, but she doesn't have the full context of, well, how might I consider what has occurred in my life that I might integrate that to then determine what kind of career is appropriate for me, what kind of career path is appropriate, what is it appropriate to have a family at this point in my life? That'd be a much more difficult question. And that'd be more, a psychologist would help you with that. But there's Nathaniel Branden, who has a lot to say about self-esteem and whatnot. And that's a way to think about integration. And so those are the two different approaches I could point out that have extensive things written about it. But I can't really point anything out by Rand specifically, other than her general advice of like integrating or thinking about your self-interest, thinking about evidence, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, the scientific context is interesting too, but I was thinking more broadly, which I think you touched on with Nathaniel Branden, where it's, yes, in terms of things you notice that might relate to your work or specific scientific studies, but also just general things that come up in the day. Like in a good example would be Howard Rourke in The Fountainhead, where he sits with the dean and he's noticing something in the dean that he's seen elsewhere, and he makes a note to himself of like, there's something behind this, and then later on he integrates that into the principle behind the dean. I don't really know if that's a scientific. Maybe you could use some methods of science to help you make those integrations more efficiently and more productively. But that's the kind of stuff I'm wondering if there's a lot of thinking on. Because, you know, you can pass a whole day, right? And you do all these things and you're like, yeah, I'm going for a run because it's healthy, or I'm doing this because of this. But how integrated are those reasons that I'm using to motivate myself to do certain things? I don't know how deep those things go. Like, they're not necessarily connected to every other part of my life. I can't tie them to previous experiences that easily. So I'm, yeah, in that direction of very broadly, how do you make your whole life as a continuous whole as possible and as integrated as possible? What I got from what you were saying, it sounds like there's been some work done, uh, both in science, so like you mentioned the logical leap, and then also more broadly or value-wise or psychological-wise with Nathaniel Branden.
Right. I'll take it a bit backwards here. I don't want to present in just a deductive way. So we could think of Rand discussing before reason and that being necessary for your existence and your survival and knowledge. And it's more the principles of reason. We're going off here, and a lot of principles of reason would apply to science generally. I mean, we're not talking about specific like hypotheses and how you develop theory. And yeah, that would be specifically science, but broadly speaking, what counts as evidence? Like, how would you know? Like, you need evidence in your day-to-day life. You need to know, like, evidence that how you should behave, or evidence that even what Rand is saying is correct, or on that level, that should always be present within us. And so we have various ways of using reason, and Rand presented all those different, as far as like the different virtues, or being paying attention and thinking holistically. But then we can narrow that down even more to like, well, what sort of things are required to think this way? How do we focus our mind? How do we integrate? Like, how do we put ourselves in a frame of mind where we can do this, where we're reasoning and thinking and not in a haze? We're not just going on impulse or intuition, or somebody else said. Like, what does that mean? How do we employ our means of survival, which is reason? So what Rand had been getting into, as you probably recall early in, she's saying the choice to think, the choice to focus, really underlies all these things. So one of the most basic things you can do, how you integrate, how you think properly, is to focus. Like, pay attention, look at what's in front of you, and think about that, not just like whatever strikes you, but what you generally do when you focus and pay attention. Like right now, you decided to study objectivist thought and the objectivist ethics in the first essay, and that you have to focus your mind in a different way than you would when you say just watching a movie. You focus your mind differently. And yeah, something like that. And like just those basic ways of thinking. But really, I think the takeaway point from objectivist ethics for that essay is the choice to focus, and everything could fall from there, or that's the starting point of your thinking.
Yep. Yes. Yep. So that's taking it back to what the point of that part of the essay was. But then, so I understand that part, but then, and it's simple enough to understand, but what is difficult, I'll give you an example. Like, let's say I'm reading something, and I was reading a bit of the Objectivism Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff today in the earlier parts, which is on epistemology and sense perception and integration of percepts into concepts and that kind of thing. And I can sit there in this one part and I'm like, okay, can I identify an experience in my life or a memory that relates to what is being discussed here? And I might sit there for 5 minutes. I'm like, I can't recall anything right now. I don't know. So I'm focusing, but it's not necessarily a very efficient process because it doesn't tell me how long should I try and recall memories? What kind of questions should I ask to best recall memories and experiences that are related to this specific passage? And so I understand I can focus, but then the complications, this is getting completely off track, but it is very interesting to me. once you choose to focus, but then once you're focusing, there is so much complication, and I do wonder, like, yeah, how much thought has been put into developing really efficient processes of thought, um, appropriate or good questions to recall specific experiences related to the passage you're reading, how best to integrate that with all the rest of your knowledge, which is massive. Like, how are you going to bring all that up from the subconscious? Like, so all of that stuff to me is, I know that's not the point of this essay and we're getting off track, but I'm super curious if there's thought on all of that. And so it sounds like maybe a bit with Nathaniel Brandon, maybe a bit with Harriman, but it's up to us to work that out.
Right. Right. That's like the responsibility of science, like a special science where you really focus down, narrow it in, pick a very specific topic within that to explore, where you need a really specific base and a specific process of thinking. And for Rand philosophy, it's more the general way of thinking that you frame everything first, which underlies everything, but then for the special sciences or any hard sciences to narrow down on those questions. Because clearly thinking about those things have to do with like some specific questions within neuroscience probably, or within psychology. How can your neurons fire? Like what's a sustainable, a most efficient way to have your neurons firing effectively? What's the easiest way to recall your memories? And part of that's my own interest in my studies within psychology. I want to know more efficient ways of thinking, more efficient ways of being creative, more efficient ways of recalling information when you want it, when you need it. And those are very important questions and very worthwhile pursuits. And clearly this is more an introductory essay. Even the Objectivist Ethics or Objectivist Epistemology book is just an introduction. You're not going to get a full picture. So you're right to have those curiosities that there will always be more questions for sure. There's always more to analyze and figure out.
So it sounds like these questions I have may be questions of a specialized science, which is psychology in this case, integrated with philosophy.
Yeah, that would be a good way to phrase that. Just being integrated with your way you've acquired support, like incorporating everything. I mean, there's even in classic philosophy, like the ancient Romans, and ancient Greeks, memory was very important to their very discussion of how you become a good thinker, a virtuous person, all that. Those were important questions. So, I mean, historically, that has been considered too.
Okay, one idea I had then would be, so I can study all these objectivist essays for the general idea, and obviously go into details where it's relevant to the general idea. But then if I want to specifically improve thought processes that are then integrated within epistemology that I've thought through and chosen, I might do something like pick up books from people who think really well and productively, and a proxy or a way to estimate that might be the amount of people that reference their ideas. It might be the discoveries they've made, the books they've, like the amount of books they've written. And so find some book that they've written, maybe they've written one about thinking, and mine all these different books from different thinkers and try and figure out like what are their questions they're asking, what thought processes they're using. Maybe you can mine ancient philosophy too, or just even modern philosophy for these kind of efficient or productive thought processes. And the book that came to mind was there's this economist. I haven't read him. I forgot. Maybe I read one of his essays, and he wrote a book on like the art of thinking or something.
Well, there's Thinking Fast and Slow.
Maybe there's that too. Yeah. But also, what was his name? Anyway, it's irrelevant to the point. But I mean, that's an example of someone who's written like 20 books, and he's an economist, and he's got a book on the art of thinking. So you might mine all these different books on different people's thought processes and just kind of take what's useful, discard what's not. Because there doesn't seem to be a entire field dedicating to specifically improving thought processes.
Yeah, I would agree, at least not within philosophy. I mean, that'd be kind of like philosophy of mind and logic a lot of the time. But I think as far as like outside study or incorporating other ideas or narrowing down into things. It's a lot about, are those thinkers trying to apply reasoning in a similar way? Are they trying to be evidence-based, empirical? Are they, what is their approach to science? What is their approach to thinking? And at least as far as Rand talking about a holistic way of thinking about your whole history, she would say that it wouldn't be just a matter of finding ideas you like and looking at those and tossing out the rest, but even within ideas, you have to understand an entire context of where they're coming from. Because we could talk about different scientists that have interesting ideas, but there's a lot of problematic things of the way they approach science and things like that. So thinking efficiently even will precede everything about science, that you have to kind of judge what you're reading yourself, judge what you're seeing yourself, and judge if that's integrating different information and different pieces like that. And so it's valuable something to never jump into what you're reading. Like, well, that's probably why you're studying Ayn Rand, because you don't want to just jump into it and assume everything is merely true because she says it, but you're focusing on it, you're thinking about it, you're considering it, and you have been considering things within the context of your life. So you've been kind of going through that process already, and like on the process of narrowing down your thinking, making it more precise, more focused, more integrated.
Yep, I agree. And good point on the context, because you could have someone who reached the wrong conclusions, but the thinker is good to learn from because maybe his thought processes are great. So, but I mean, that's a whole separate thing again. So, cool. I mean, that's I think all finished with that tangent. I'm just going through these questions that I have here. Okay, this is when she gets to the objectivist, I think, the objectivist virtues or values. I can't remember the wording, but she says reason is a value. And
yes.
And so okay, 3 cardinal values was the wording. I guess they lie at the base of everything else. And together they're the means to and the realization of one's ultimate value, so which is life. And the 3 cardinal values are reason, purpose, and self-esteem. And then there's the 3 corresponding virtues. So my question was with reason being a value, like, so I remember she defined it as the reason is something like the faculty that integrates percepts into concepts.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay, close enough anyway. But then why is that, like, a faculty is not like, yes, you can choose to exercise that faculty, but why is it a value? It's like, it's a value just as much as my eye is a value, or it's a value just as much as any other physical part of me that I didn't put there as a value. So maybe I understand the use of reason as a value, but I don't understand just holding, maybe that's what she means actually, the use of reason and not reason as a faculty. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
When I think faculty, I think something it's just there.
Yeah, the way I think it is more the use of reason. I think that's the most charitable interpretation of Rand in that context, because she's talking about what you need to have your flourishing life. Like your life is your top value. That's everything. Cardinal values would be the things that are like just below that. What are the things absolutely necessary for that survival, for that long-term existence, for your life as a whole over the long term? So reason, the process of reasoning and the ability to use reason, that's a value you should have and pursue, that you need to, it's an active thing rather than a passive thing, that you have to choose to do reason. It's not a thing that happens like your sight, like you see or not, regardless if you choose to see or not. If your eyes are open, you're going to see. So it's not like that. I mean, they're primary in the sense that you have to actively use them. They're there, you have to pursue it, and they're absolutely necessary for your existence. That you must use, like, earlier in the essay, she was discussing, like, as the means of survival, how their knowledge is so necessary for your flourishing. So you have those things, and self-esteem would be a value in the sense of valuing yourself, as in that you're valuing your life and pursuing it, and purpose as in, like, even just where is it going, like your purpose is to live. That they're kind of like one and the same. They're not just, you can unify them in a way that you don't have to think of them as distinct always. They kind of feed into each other. You can't really have one without the other. And more like these are the top things you need to survive and to exist. And anything else you think of as a value would either be like a sub value of those. Like your career could be like a sub value of your purpose. Or your self-esteem could be some value, like taking care of your health. Like your health is just like a sub value of that. And reason, like say learning could be like a sub value of that, like, or learning about economics would be like a sub value. Like that's your means of using reason, that you're applying it in those ways. So those are just the things you have, the things you want to have. Like once you attain them, you're living a flourishing life when you have those things. That you must attain those things.
Yeah, it's hard to. This is probably similar to the previous discussion, so we don't need to go too deep into it, but it would be hard to measure, like, at what point have I attained an appropriate amount of the use of my reason, or like, at what point am I best integrated with all, like, what I'm studying and what I'm doing, reason, in terms of reason, purpose, and self-esteem. Like, maybe that goes back to, you mentioned Tara Smith's, I forgot her book, whatever, the ethics, some ethics book. But yeah, I mean, those are difficult questions too, I think. Like, because you just an example, you said economics is the realization of reason, but if you're studying economics, it's also a purpose.
Yeah.
So it's I can tell it's a hard that'd be a hard thing to think through.
Within Rand's claims are mostly going towards that, like the point of value is your life, and there really isn't any, like, if anything feeds into that, it's just in a way means to an end, but the only value in itself, or the only end in itself, is your life. Like once you get to your life, there isn't, why do you live? I mean, there, under Rand's conception, there isn't anything else. Everything leads to, or ought to lead to, your living. That for something to count as a value in a normative sense, that it must fulfill your life and make it better, or whatever it goes into it. One thing you have to watch out for is not being like overcorrecting and not trying to be like a super reasoning robot that can never make a mistake and will always be computing something. That's not what Rand is really trying to convey. She's more trying to convey you as a living organism, and you must live like that. I mean, by choosing to focus, she's not saying you must be a ninja at every single second of your life. She's saying you have to focus your mind in order to think, and that's the thing you need to do. But the point is not to be this computer that always has the final correct answers. It's not trying to, like, reason is the means of which you survive and everything. That's important, but reason doesn't have to mean that you're trying to have standards outside of what makes for human reasoning, that we're trying to measure by standards of human organisms and human life. Not about just, are we applying reason, but are we applying reason in the way it's applying reason for the why we use it as our means of survival. It's not about, say, art. Like some Christian might think that applying reason is merely the thing to do because it's what God wishes us to do. And some Christian could argue that, but they're not thinking in terms of reason as a purpose in their own life, and it's supposed to serve them and serve their own existence. And that's the sort of thing to think of, not reason as this disembodied thing beyond us, but reason as part of our life, as much as we need to like walk around, we need to reason in the same way. If anything, reasoning is even more important than that. So it really all comes down to thinking as yourself as a holistic organism, not just these abstract concepts we're trying to fulfill, but living life as a living organism.
Yeah, so I mean, I could boil that down to reason as an ingredient. I mean, there are three cardinal virtues. Reason as an ingredient for a flourishing life, meaning, yes, you're not walking around constantly computing and integrating. You may have a moment where you're just with a partner or whatever it is, or surfing or doing something where you're just in the moment.
Yeah, that could count as focusing, I would say, by the way. Like even like being in the moment can be counted as focus, but like it's thinking about not being this absolutely perfect ninja that at a moment's notice he'll like dodge bullets like Neo in the Matrix. Like it's not trying to be superhuman, but within the constraints of humans, what does it mean to be human? Like doing all the things for that.
Yeah. So with the other point you mentioned was the focus being a precondition for thinking, which I read a bit about that I was just reading the Opar book.
Right.
So focus as a precondition for thinking. In that case, would reason be, because reason, from what I got, was the faculty of integrating the percepts into concepts. And so if you're focused, does that mean you're not necessarily you can be focused but not necessarily be using reason? Does that make sense? Because
yeah,
yeah.
I think that's a good question. I would say that's a very technical and fine question. Like, I mean, that's an interesting question to pursue. So my initial way of thinking about that is that it's, I wouldn't call it the same as reason, but I think by focusing, you're almost going to reason right away. I mean, you're focusing and that allows you to reason. It's not usually the case that you focus without thinking soon after. I guess there could be exceptions that, and strictly speaking, I wouldn't call it reason. I mean, you could focus your mind like a Buddhist monk, and that's fine. And that can be very good for thinking clearly and thinking well. But when you're in that state of merely focusing, you're not integrating, you're not actively thinking, you're not producing values, you're not actively doing something. That's the way I would approach that question. Like, because it's not enough to focus. Being focused won't do all these things automatically. Like being focused allows you to be in that state, to be ready to act when you wish and when you want. It's like a state of readiness, I would call it. I mean, Rand wasn't quite specific what she meant by focus. I would have had to ask her. I'm sure there's some line somewhere in some essay where she mentions it, but I think that'd be the best way to think of it. Like it's just readying your mind and being ready to think.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, you could, I was thinking about what you're talking about with the monk. You could be focused and not reasoning in this. I'm trying to find wording for this. Focused and not reasoning in that specific moment where you're focused, meaning you're meditating. You gave that example.
Yeah.
But the overall context you have set with reason. So you've said, I want to meditate because it will enhance thought processes or whatever. So I'm going to dedicate 20 minutes to meditating. And so while in that 20 minutes, you're not using a process of reason, you're not recalling memories, you're not asking questions, you're just breathing and focusing on breath or whatever it is you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
You've reasoned yourself into that context, but in that context, you're not then reasoning. So you're focused. I don't think focus necessarily implies a process of reasoning happen during focusing. Because you've given the example, you're just open, your eyes are focused. If there's a predator, you will then think or act. But if you're just, your eyes are focused and you're just walking around and you've chosen to, do that, you've reasoned yourself like, I need to go meditate or I need to go pick up something. I don't see why it would mean you have to then initiate a process of reason while you're focused. So I think, yeah, anyway, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I think that is the right way to look at it, because at least considering the way Rand usually looks at things and the way she, like what kind of language she uses, is she always praises very much, or even demonstrating what it means to be applying reason. I mean, whenever you read about objectivist epistemology, or she talks about somebody's accomplishment, she always will be focusing on what process of thinking they use. She won't usually go on, oh, he was so great at focusing. It's like, yeah, you need to focus, but it's not really going to be enough. And clearly what she praises isn't an argument, but you see it fits within her frame of thinking, that when we've been talking about reason and knowledge, it clearly she's trying to get us to consider beyond just a state of either focus or just being on or thinking, but what it serves us, what good does it do in our lives. And reason will always be a part of that. It does get complicated, of course, as you acknowledge, and beyond that, I think we get really into the fine details, which I think is fine to leave aside for now. You can come back to it once you've learned more and get different insights on it.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And I like you mentioned when you're reading, invoking a principle of charitable interpretation. I think in terms of extracting the most out of a text, then I think it's a good, yeah, I like that. I want to explore it more in charitable interpretation. Have you put any thought into thinking about charitable interpretation? So when you're reading a text, how to be most charitable? I know this is, again, going off topic, but is there anything on that?
I don't think it's very off topic, actually. I think it's really, really critical to this. Well, that's what we're doing. We're reading and interpreting and trying to understand that way. So I think charitable interpretation, I don't actively try to think of that. I just think in terms of what's consistent with their way of thinking, and not try to be consistent that it makes more sense to me, but just consistent as in what makes sense, and not just trying to say it sounds silly. I'm going to say it's a stupid idea, and that's that. I mean, usually there's more to an idea than when you initially look at it, so you have to just fit it into the context of everything a person is saying. It's easy to judge somebody based on a little quick passage. Well, even a passage can be fair a lot of the time, but it's easy to judge too much of a person based on one passage. You have to really take into the context of all their thinking, or as best to your ability. Say charitable as in not just trying to find a weakness in the one argument that they made one time, but how does it fit within the wider context of their frame of thinking, the wider context of their thought. And there's a few books I know about just general education about logic and critical thinking that have been useful to me. They're nothing really complicated, just things to be aware of. There's things probably you do naturally already, but sometimes it's good to have something written down, made explicit of what you're doing. So you can just come to mind. It's easier to recall in your mind what it is you're doing, to think well and think carefully when interpreting and reading somebody.
What are those books? I'll write them down.
I have to check my small library, but I have a few books. I'll send you some links later. Maybe it's only 2 or 3 books, but they're useful things at least to have to consider.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'm interested in that. And I think if you make it explicit, if it's written down explicitly, you may see something you don't already do, and then you take that and use it when you read next time, which is great if you use it. Cool. Let's see what else I got here. I got a massive notepad with only about one essay. I haven't even gone. We're just one essay in.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's probably one of the most important essays by Rand at all. So if you get this one, you'll get everything else falls in place much easier, because it's mostly like expanding on what she's already written. Like this gives you the whole framework. So once you get this framework, you're just trying to figure out like any that was not satisfactory explained to you, she'll generally get to it. Like you might wonder, like, well, it's great that I can do all these things, but you might be somebody who thinks like, well, everybody's too stupid though, and nobody's going to bother. So why do I care about them? I'll just use force and do whatever I want with them. I mean, it's that kind of thing. Like you might have different arguments in your head that it's like, oh, well, she left this out. Well, yeah, it's a sketch, but all the other essays really are to fill in those concerns for the most part.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, so I think I know the answer to this, is in it'll veer off. Again, we don't need to go into it, but it'll just be references for books. But it's about multiple purposes and their integration, because, you know, three cardinal values: reason, purpose, self-esteem. Purpose could encompass so many things, and then how they all fit together. I don't know. Maybe that's not something she answers. That's for psychology, and that's for...
Yeah, I'd say that's just a really difficult question, and I can come up with answers, but that's usually when I like answering more when in the full context and written out, because I mean the general idea is that within the context of your life, there's certain way things that present themselves to you, or just the way things are, that there's got to be some choice to make in the situation that's best for your furtherance of your life, that's best for your flourishing. And thinking about like what other ends are possible, that's really a matter of asking, well, can you have ends besides your life? Which I know we've kind of touched on, and maybe I mentioned this before, but say if your ultimate pursuit was just, say, just climbing Mount Everest, and that was your goal in life, and that was it, everything was to that purpose and to that end. You would have to think, well, as a living organism, I'm pursuing that thing. Is there, when I think about the widest context and the most fundamental terms of existence or non-existence, that choice would be leading in some direction. We have to be able to figure out what direction that is, and I think that's the best I could answer at this point without dragging in other concepts that might make it more complicated than I want it to be right now. But I think that's a good question to ask and good thing to pursue and consider, because I think that's one of the more difficult questions. And yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the point of a lot of objectivist ethics. How do you figure out what these things are? I mean, right now might really do seem like there's more than one option, but really by studying what the ethics are, but what the nature of man is, what your nature is, that helps you then understand whether there's one right answer for you, or there's how you choose these things. And of course, when you feel more comfortable with it, I could tell you plenty of other philosophers, but just depends on what approach you want for now. Like I would just stick with this for now, and then we can come back to it later.
Agree. And one thing that I've been thinking about in terms of this question is, I guess you could use philosophy to give you a broad framework, but in terms of getting into the specifics, like you mentioned, the guy climbing the mountain, well, then how does his relationship fit in with his goal to climb the mountain? All those more complicated questions. How does his other hobby of reading detective novels fit into his quest to climb the mountain and so on. That question, like, I mean, or details of like how best to balance different pursuits, those kind of questions where there's maybe not that much written about it. My thinking on that right now is that I don't know if, oh, we'll just go with philosophers. Some philosophers, like, I don't know if you know School of Life as an organization.
Mhm.
Um, One of the guys who works with them wrote a book about finding fulfilling work. And there's some ideas in there that are great. And there's some in there where I just question they're broad, sort of abstract processes of reasoning. And there's so much room for them to be mistaken. Like he might recommend, for example, um, don't necessarily go work for a company that produces, don't confuse the input and the output, meaning don't go work for a company that necessarily produces something amazing that you love, but go work at one that'll speak to your talents and your interests. Like if you like graphics design, maybe you could work for an oil company and designing logos. But there's so much room in that process of his thinking for it to go wrong, because there are plenty of people who are very successful and happy in their career that would say, no, go work at a company where you love what
Right.
they do, even if you're cleaning the floor. And so he's using a very abstract process of reasoning that isn't necessarily tested through trial and error in his own life, versus say, an entrepreneur or someone else who's like constantly going out trying things and like, yes, this has been the best thing for me. So anyway, why did I tell that story? I'm just saying, like, I guess sometimes when you go to the more abstract books, when they're written by certain thinkers, because they're so abstract and they're not necessarily tested, they might sound great on paper, but in reality, they don't work. And so my thinking on it is now the best way to answer this sort of question of integrating different interests and how best to pursue career and how that fits in with everything else is just to look to people, maybe who you look to people who you look up to and learn from them. Like if it's Elon Musk, try and see how he thinks about work and how he thinks about life, and then see what you can take from that fits into that broader framework that you've established in from philosophy for yourself. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it, but also being critical of them, but also acknowledging honestly to yourself when they're doing something you honestly think is a bad idea or not very integrated or not very wise. I mean, it's more like that, being critical of them, just taking things in as a complete whole. Like don't cherry pick an individual thing. I mean, don't even cherry pick one individual. You see what they've done in their life, because I mean, they're not you. In the most trivial sense, they can't really, you can't expect the same thing to work for you. I mean, I don't want to make that sound like each and every individual person can do whatever the hell they want. It's more like your context will be different. There's different principles you might have to, or different facts you might need to consider, including like any mental illness you might have. I mean, clearly that would affect how you would decide what the right course of action is. Even more narrowly within psychology, you can know what people do generally, but it's still not going to tell you on its own what everybody should do. Because even if you know what 70 works for 70% of people, well, you might be the other 30% that for some reason or another, they need to do it differently. Like as I said, mental illness could be a really good reason to need to do it different. If you're dyslexic, I mean, there's no moral flaw clearly in being dyslexic, but you can't pursue the same goals in the same way. Because, like, I mean, if only 1% of the people in the world are dyslexic, well, you have to do it different than 99% of the people in the world. And that's the kind of thing you have to keep in mind. Just, if you think about people holistically, you also have to consider where the differences come in. And that's why you would even judge people morally differently. Because we're born in different circumstances, not that it changes what the moral rules are, necessarily changes the justification for things, but it affects what you know and even how you develop as an individual. And that's also holistic thinking, because you're not just trying to find the one rule, the 5 rules that work for every entrepreneur. Like there's no such thing. You have to take the 5 principles and figure out, like, modify it as you need and do that. I mean, reason, you still be applying reason, but how you apply your reason will lead you to different specific answers. Like if you use reason to decide your career, like you might initially say, oh yeah, I want to be a graphic designer, but when you think about it more, it's like, well, I like that and I learn a lot, but I've come to realize that I prefer like electrical engineering and developing like visual detection software. Like for whatever reason, you might change your mind and you just go that direction based on what you discover.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. We can go to a specific example. So maybe like, okay, let's say you read about, I think his name's Jocko Willink. He wakes up at 4 a.m. and he talks about the benefits of waking up at 4 a.m. What you might do is like, how does you then ask yourself, like, how does that fit into my life, obviously? But you can just try it, right? Like you try it for a week and then you're like, wow, this guy's impressive. I haven't watched anything by Jocko Willink. I just know he's like talks about waking up at 4 a.m. You can try it. And if you think like this might fit into my life, I'm going to try this. He says it makes him better at X, Y, Z or whatever it is. He makes him more productive, makes him get more done. So I'm going to just try it for a week. And then if it doesn't work, then discard it. And if it does work, like keep doing it. Maybe that sort of, because it's hard to like, you can think about, I get what you're saying. Like, I'm not Elon Musk, you are not Elon Musk, but I mean, like you can look at what he's doing in his life and how he's thinking like, okay, maybe he started companies early. So if I want to get into entrepreneurship, then start little projects and try and abstract away from the things he's done that you like and then turn them into things you can action with minimal downside, something like that.
Yeah, or we could think of, well, might be another reason to say that reason is a cardinal value. It's not one of those things that vary between people, because by nature, you need to use reason to survive. So everyone needs to use reason. There's no exception. If you didn't need reason, you wouldn't be human. Like you could try to imagine what would ethics be from an alien that had some other means of consciousness except conceptual consciousness. You might ask, well, they could do it in a completely different way. But since you are human, you need reason. You're going to apply it no matter what. I mean, it's not, that's why I wouldn't say graphic design is a means of survival, because it's not like the core thing you need. Not everybody even needs to be as good at it. Not everyone will be as good at it, and even you don't have to even care about it if you don't want to. Like it's an option almost. I mean, I avoid the word optional, but in the grand scheme of things, as far as people in general, it's not a requirement for your reason, but reason is. So that's something you'll always be applying, rather than contingently depending on your context where you grew up with and other conditions.
I didn't get that last bit. So you're saying use your reason instead of depending on other conditions, meaning
No, I meant like using reason isn't just contingent upon your context. Using a reason applies to a context in the sense it applies to your life, but it doesn't vary. Like applying reason won't depend on if it's, say, winter or not, if you're hungry or not. It's not going to, you don't suddenly need to stop needing to reason because for some condition. Like sort of like if you're tired, like you can stop running around. Like it's like you don't need to be running all the time. Or you don't need to be reading a book all the time. Sometimes you can read a book and sometimes you can just stop it completely. But you can't really stop reason by nature of being human. If you stopped reason, you would start to slowly die because you wouldn't be all those other things you know reasons for. I'm just trying to bring to mind that you don't want to focus so much on I differ from people, therefore I can apply unique principles to me. I don't need reason, even if most people do. Like Rand's really trying to argue that everyone needs reason, but we apply it to our own lives.
Right. It would be hard to argue that anyway, because what part of reasoning is asking questions. So even by looking at someone and asking questions about what you like and don't like and why, that might be, reasoning anyway. So
Yeah, I mean that is one way to look at it. I know that perspective is talked about in other objectivist literature, that like if you're reasoning, doesn't that imply you already chose life? Or can you reason, can you say you're reasoning if you're applying it to lens besides life? Like things like that. I mean, that is a good question to ask and has been considered.
I'll stop the recording. Well.